Good day, and today we're going to look at American modernism when we look at American literature. Now the time periods we'll be covering today in this video will be about from 1914 to 1945. So we're going to look at before this time period. What is the background that will produce American modernism in literature? We start with Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species in 1859. Now this is going to radically alter the 19th century romantic view that nature, especially human nature, was benign. Also, the works of Karl Marx and the work of Freud, as well as other great intellectual explorers and rebels, had mounted an assault against the orthodox religious faith that is going to last into the 20th century. World War I, which is at the beginning of modernism, is going to deepen doubt and reauthorize a sense of disillusionment with humankind. And another source of disillusionment was the rapid transformation of American society that accelerated along with World War I. So then what is modernism? Modernism is a cultural movement that generally includes the progressive art and architecture, the design, literature, music, dance, painting, and other visual arts, which emerged in the beginning of the 20th century, particularly in the years following World War I. Now, modernism in literature is not easily summarized, but if you're looking for different parts of the umbrella, the key elements are experimentation, anti-realism, individualism, and a stress on the intellect rather than emotional aspects. Now, the works of modernist writers are usually characterized by showing disenchantment, dislocation, and alienation of humankind in the world, which is a reaction to the violent upheaval known as the modern age. So when we look at modernism, when we look at the literature itself, you're going to see a lot of disillusionment, especially from the expatriates, the expats who move over to France and other parts of Europe. There's this fragmentation that we don't feel like we have a sense of home, a sense of nature, a sense of being at a certain place in a certain time. There's a certain uncertainty that is coming along with that. Also in your literature, there's going to be often omitted exposition, transitions, and resolutions. It seems like there is no definite beginning and no definite ending, and you could move back and forth between flashbacks without having proper transitions. A lot of times we'll also see people stretching the boundaries of traditional types of literature and poetry and drama. It's going to be that kind of idea of right outside the box. We're going to experiment by taking away traditional set forms and formats. One of those that is going to become quite popular in the modernist movement is the stream of consciousness. So when we look at the different parts of American modernism, there is really no defined set as to when they begin and when they end, except for underneath the big umbrella around 1914, the beginning of World War I in Europe, to about 1945, the end of World War II in Europe. And in this time period, you're going to see modern poetry expand by experimenting in its form. And most of that poetry is going to fall under the umbrella of Imagism. You also have the lost generation, those expatriate writers writing, their prose writing, and we're going to call that modern or realist. You're also going to see your novels of social awareness. People are going to start writing about more civil rights. We are just right before the civil rights movement, and we're also going to see a lack of wanting to do the traditional social norms. The Harlem Renaissance in the United States will also pick up here around the 1920s and the 1930s, where we're seeing African Americans, now with the actual education that has been given to them, they're going to start looking back at their own heritage and trying to leave a legacy. In nonfiction, we're going to see the new criticism movement in which people are critiquing literature. And the 20th century American drama is going to experiment not only in formats, just like the poets have done, but they're also going to pick up a lot of that social awareness that you see in the novels. So let's start with poetry. Let's look at that Imagist movement. It is a movement in the US and English poetry that is characterized by the use of concrete language and figures of speech. It will also use very modern subject matter. You'll notice it has a metrical freedom. You're not going to see the traditional format that you would expect from poetry. And there's an avoidance of the romantic and mystical themes that was so prevalent and so important in the 19th century. Instead, it's going to aim at a clarity of expression through the use of precise visual images. Your first leader of the Imagist movement in poetry is going to be led by the USA's Ezra Pound, and then Amy Lowell, and then after that you're going to see several others pick up the movement. Now, there is an Imagist manifesto that comes out in 1912 that showed 3 Imagist poetic principles. First, a direct treatment of the thing. There's going to be no fuss, no frill, no ornaments. You're not going to see any romantic or mystical themes. You're not going to see a lot of description. It's a very concrete image. You're going to see an exclusion of superfluous words, precision and economy of expression. You need to state what it is. If the reader wants to imagine something else, great, that's where we get the word imagine and Imagist from, but you are going to have precision and an economy of expression when you write Imagist poetry. You're also going to be seeing a rhythm of the musical phrase rather than the sequence of a metronome, free verse form, and music. So you'll not only see free verse taking hold, if there is rhythm, we're going to be looking more at a sense of musical phrasing, like say sense with, for example, in the Harlem Renaissance, there's going to be a lot of poetry coming out that sounds like it goes along with a jazz sort of feeling instead. You're not going to see traditional meters and rhythm being used in Imagist poetry. There also existed great influence of Chinese poetry on the Imagist movement. Imagists found value in Chinese poetry because, by its virtue of ideographic and pictographic nature, the language is quite precise and it is quite vivid in its imagery. They will also be influenced by the Japanese haiku, even though Japanese haiku is very precise when it comes to its rhythm and how many syllables and meters that it uses. They once again are very precise and economic in their expression and very concrete with their expression. Now we have these major representatives of modern poetry. Once again, Ezra Pound is going to be one of the first that comes along, but other Americans that we're going to see picking up the modern poetry movement are going to be people like T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams, Robert Frost, and E.E. Cummings. So we said, looking at the Chinese poetry and the Japanese haiku, it is quite an influence on most of these Imagist poets in America. So let's take a look at one, for example, about autumn. Evening crows perch on old trees, wreathed with withered vine. Water of a stream flows by a family cottage near a tiny bridge. A lean horse walks on an ancient road in western breeze. The sun is setting in the west. The heartbroken one is at the end of the earth. And again, we might be looking at very short, precise movements, very short, precise expressions when we take Asian poetry and turn it into a U.S. modern expression of poetry. For example, in A Station of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Now, when we look at this particular poem, this is a metro that is the underground railway of Paris. And when we think of the word apparition with its double meaning, it binds the two aspects of the observation together. First, apparition could mean an appearance of something, in the sense of something which appears or shows up, or something which can be clearly observed. Now, an apparition could also mean something which seems real, but is not real, something ghostly, which cannot be clearly observed. Now, the poem is an observation by the poet of the human faces that are seen in a Paris subway station. It looks to be a modern adoption of the Japanese haiku. Now, as he tries to render exactly his observation of human faces seen in an underground railway station, the observer sees the faces turned variously towards the light and the darkness, like flower petals, which are half absorbed and then half resisting by the wet, dark texture of a tree bough. Now, repeating it, you can have a colorful picture. You can also feel the beauty of music through its repetition of different vowels and consonants. And when you look at the tone of the poem Metro, you might get this feeling of wistfulness or ambiguity, maybe this sense of touch and sight, but not really being clear on what it is that you're touching or seeing. Now, Ezra Pound is the first acquired leader that we suspect is for the Imagist poetry. So let's take a look at one of his Imagist poems, Fan Piece, for her imperial lord. O fan of white silk, clear as frost on the grass blade, you also are laid aside. So some of the figures of speech that we see being used in his Imagist poem are usual ones that we see being used with others like T.S. Eliot, Amy Lowell, Wallace Stevens, E.E. Cummings. We see things such as the apostrophe being used, where we're directly addressing the person that is reading or hearing the poem. It is an Imagist poem, so you'll see lots of imagery. For example, the contrasting of frost on a grass blade. Grass blade when showing the sense of life and the sense of warmth, but you have frost, the sense of it dying on top of it. You have a metaphor in this short poem. She is the fan piece. And finally, the theme, there's this feeling of being unwanted, this feeling of a fleeting feeling. Again, that sense of disillusionment that is coming through in the modernist age, where we don't quite feel that we are together. There's some disparate kind of sensation here. And again, we saw that with the previous poems that we were pulling from Chinese poetry and from Japanese haiku, where we could have two meanings of our imagery. One that is very clear and concrete, and one that seems quite fleeting. Thank you so much for stopping by for this quick introduction into modernism, in particular into the Imagist poets. If you'd like to learn more about the Imagist poets, or you'd like me to go into 20th century drama, or maybe perhaps the novels of social awareness, please leave a comment down below, and I'll continue to make videos on the modernist movement. And as always, I appreciate it if you subscribed. Take care.